In Isaac Storm, the author tells the story of the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. This is the deadliest natural disaster in the United States history. He tells the story primarily through the eyes of one man who not only lived through it, but was responsible for predicting it. Isaac Klein was the chief meteorologist of the Galveston office of the U.S. Weather Bureau at the time. This technique was very effective in order to keep a narrative that was easy to read and yet still imparted all the important information. While the technology at the time did not permit accurate recording of conditions as we are used to in modern times, by all accounts, the storm was an absolute monster, believed to be a Category 4 when it struck the coast of Galveston. Storm surge was estimated to be a minimum of 8 feet, although 15 to 20 is sometimes cited. Klein's failure to accurately predict how destructive and dangerous this storm would be cost him not only professionally, but personally. His wife was killed when their home collapsed in the storm surge, and he was barely able to rescue his 3 daughters. The destruction in Galveston was absolutely unprecedented. An estimated 7,000 buildings were destroyed. In today's dollars, the storm caused well over $1 billion in damage. Some sections of the city were completely wiped out. In places, it was as if nothing ever existed there to begin with. The storm brought a violent end to what up to that point had been considered the golden era of Galveston. Now, there were several factors that made this storm so destructive, beyond just its size and strength. First factor was simply the time in history. In 1900, meteorology was in its infancy as a scientific discipline. There were as many unknowns and assumptions as there were certainties. Put simply, they didn't know what they didn't know. Also, the instruments of that era were completely inadequate compared to modern equipment when it came to predicting hurricanes. There was also no modern building codes or standards set to withstand hurricanes. While storm surge is often cited as the most deadly consequence of a hurricane, an argument can be made in this case that human arrogance was more deadly, as this quote from Klein clearly demonstrates. Additionally, not only did they fail to predict that a powerful hurricane was coming, those who suspected it were certain that it would go into the Atlantic and not the Gulf. Again, they didn't know what they didn't know. This NOAA map demonstrates what only 8 feet of storm surge would have done to Galveston. And again, some cite as high as 15 or even 20 feet. All of this was further exacerbated by Willis Moore, the head of the U.S. Weather Bureau, who was more concerned with politics, his career, and having control than saving lives or serving the public good. His obsession with controlling who had access to and who was allowed to disseminate warnings and information was counterproductive in the extreme. His career was brought down eventually by Klein many years later in an unrelated incident. All of these factors, combined with the size and strength of the storm itself, is what led to the storm being such a disaster. While the death toll can only be estimated, 8,000 is most often cited as the casualty list. Sometimes as low as 6,000 and as high as 12,000 is sometimes cited. Regardless of the precise number, it is by far the deadliest natural disaster in history for the United States. Galveston had become a city of corpses. Eventually, bodies were burned, buried at sea, or buried just where they were found. And the author spares little detail in describing how horrific the conditions were. And anyone who's ever experienced something remotely close to it can attest to how accurate his description is. While the author told the story mainly from the perspective of Klein, he does not ignore other tales of human tragedy. Perhaps the single greatest one was an orphanage that was all but annihilated. All of the nuns and 90 out of 93 children perished when the storm destroyed it. And again, in another case of not knowing what they didn't know, the sisters tied many of the children together in small groups thinking they were helping them, when in reality, they were robbed of any chance of survival. In fact, the 3 who did survive were the only 3 who were not tied together. The destruction of Galveston became a national tragedy. It was on the front page of newspapers from one end of the country to the other. Aid and relief poured in from all over the world, but the damage had already been done. Fortunately, this storm and its destruction was enough of a focusing event that when they rebuilt Galveston, they included the building of a seawall that helped save the city a mere 15 years later when another hurricane struck. Today, the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900 is simply a piece of history, and unfortunately, history has a tendency to repeat itself. Galveston was the first lesson in the dangers of hurricanes when it comes to building at sea level. Over a century later, New Orleans was made another lesson by Katrina. As we ignore or forget our history, only time will tell where the next lesson comes from.